Hello and welcome to How to Tell Good Stories, number 13. Today we're speaking with a friend of indie comics everywhere and comic writer of Aquila and the Phoenix Guard, number 1, Nightmare Fuel, the Aardvark himself from Aardvark Comics. Aardvark.
Hi, yeah, pleasure to be on. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. I have to be honest with you. I seriously have, I've heard your name in passing probably a dozen times on random people's streams or random people talking. And I just never really, I would hear it and then it would kind of go through my head, as I do tend to. Takes probably 13 times. And so I've heard you 12 times before it stuck. So right. I'm like, it wasn't until the other day, about 4 weeks ago, that was it Kemosabe thought I already knew you, like we already talked or something, because he was like, Aardvark, and I'm like, I've seen him. I think I've shared some stuff online. He's like, oh, I thought you guys knew each other. I'm like, no, not really. So he's like, yeah, he's a good guy. So if Kemosabe is vouching for you, then I'm like, that's the guy for me to talk to. So I'm looking forward to talking to you, like I said, because of Kemosabe. And the first
Kemosabe is already my biggest fan. He was one of the first people to ever read any of my comic book writing, and because I'd never tried writing comic scripts before. I'd always been into prose, like standard kind of science fiction, fantasy prose writing, and just generally world building for fun. For no other reason other than for fun, possibly for a video game, in the future. But none of those things ever materialized. And comics had always been something that I'd been interested in, but I never really knew the process. I never really understood the process. I always thought that you have to have artistic talent to be a comic book creator. You know how it is in Japan, where it's one guy doing it. I mean, at first, when it becomes a bigger series, they have a team or whatever. But for the longest time, I thought it was like Japan, where the writer drew it as well. I didn't have my artistic ability kind of stagnated around age 12. I haven't really got much better since then. And so, upon learning that how a comic is actually made, that there is a writer who works independently of the artist in a way. Then I just said, oh, well, that sounds like something I want to do, because I've always liked comics. I like Spider-Man. I grew up reading and watching the occasional Spider-Man comic and Spider-Man animated TV series. Where I come from in England, it's kind of difficult for me to get a hold of a comic book. I kind of live out in the middle of nowhere. And so getting a comic book, a proper, 22-page floppy, it used to be a lot more difficult than it probably is today, especially with online retailers and whatnot. But we have comics in England, but they're not. They weren't they were printed on newsprint, and they were not they're more like comedy, kind of silly comics. Close, kind of like.
Okay, so kind of going, I'm going to go that direction then, as far as just in general with that. As far as when you started with comics and everything, because to me, you sound like you're from somewhere in the Liverpool area. I don't know if that's close, but
yep.
I have a couple of friends from the past that I'd worked with that are from that general region. So that's where you sound like you're from.
Okay.
And
you got a good ear for it.
Yeah. And they the only comics they said it's kind of a similar thing. The only comics they ever read were essentially either the ones that come from like Denmark or France that are translated into English. So they have that BD design where they're kind of oversized. Sometimes
Yeah,
they have a
like
hard
Asterix and Obelisk, and
right.
yeah.
Sometimes they have a hard, they're and so did you ever get into that, or did it go right into sort of like you said, they have the funnies and stuff like that sort of thing
There
going on?
was a first comic I think I ever read was a book called The Dandy.
Mm,
That was like a weekly kids. It was printed on newsprint. I think it was British,
mm-hmm,
and it had had a cast of kind of goofy characters, and I think Banana. There was a superhero, but he was a comedy superhero, and he was Banana Man, and he gained superpowers after eating
mm,
bananas. But besides that, like, I didn't really get my hand on an American comic until um, eventually I found a comic book retailer, and it
mm,
wasn't a chain store or anything like that. It was like a single guy, and it was tucked away in this part of town that was very far away from the town center, from the city center, and it was down an alleyway somewhere that I didn't even know existed, and eventually I found it. And then when I got my hands on it, the books were like £5 each, which is quite a lot for the teenager
mm-hmm.
back in those days. So getting that when I did get a comic book, I kind of cherished it, and but like I said, I didn't have much of a extensive background with it. Eventually, as the internet became a bigger thing, and I got control of my own finances, I did start investigating and digging and collecting certain things. But one of my problems is that I'm kind of a nomad. I've gone all around the world, and so accumulating a comic collection and keeping up with a series has been a challenge.
Oh yeah.
But I did get into reading a lot of manga um, in my late adolescence, and that carried on through until to today.
Mm,
Um, and so, but by the time I had, I by the time I had acclimatized to comics and stuff, all the comics that were getting put out were all terrible. So, like I didn't really get to experience much of the American comics market. So
mm-hmm,
I've gone back in time. I went right back to the start, and I started reading really old comics
mm-hmm.
from back in the day, like World War II era, a lot of characters that are in the public domain now. Um,
Right.
yeah, I did a lot of reading of those books.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Every about 15 years there's sort of a comic renaissance. If you go back and you look and you say, okay, early 30s they started, mid
Hmm.
40s they kind of came back around with the crime stuff. 60s you had Stan Lee and them, Spider-Man sort of started it, then Fantastic Four and
Yeah.
X-Men. And then it again in the 80s, you started having the independent boom that started with like Harvey P. Carr and American Splendor and Ninja Turtles. And then
Yeah.
again, you had the mid 90s where you kind of had the image revolution, but you also had Chris Claremont doing X-Men. And so it's kind of about every 15 years, there's sort of a
Hmm.
reimagining of things. And that's where we're past that now. We didn't get that. We started to get it in the late 2000s with when DC kind of did the rebirth. It started to happen a little bit, and then
Yeah.
it quickly went away. So we're definitely we're definitely late for sort of a comic renaissance. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. And we're seeing. So with CG, I've kind of gone into it. There are factions,
mhm,
not competing factions in a kind of adversarial way, but there is a clear difference between the ex pros
mhm,
and the people who have the newcomers, let's say. And what you're starting to see is a lot of the newcomers are starting to they're starting to cross over into the same kind of territory financially that the ex-pros are getting into, and I think that could be the seed, the seeds of what you were just talking about, kind of
Right.
sprouting. Um, I think we are on the verge of something completely different, where now that everybody's figured out the process, that it's fair game, and it's going to
Right.
be really exciting with a lot of competition, and especially with my book coming out this week. Um, yeah, I'm stepping into the arena and I'm showing everybody what I'm capable of as a writer. It's the first time anything I've ever done has been published or released in any kind of substantial fashion. In fact, in any way, really. So I'm very eager to hopefully stamp my name on the on the annals of history in a way.
Yeah, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here, is just talking about sort of getting to know you so that I know you personally, but also I like to talk about the idea of storytelling, because
Yeah.
that's where it's going to happen. If it's going to be Renaissance, it's going to happen with the storytelling. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, people can say what they want about, the Image Boys. Yeah, but the Image comics, they themselves, with the exception of like who Eric Larson and maybe Todd McFarlane, the rest of the guys released like 3 books before they ended up doing something else or going back to DC or Marvel.
Right.
What really started it in the 90s was those runs that we had on the X-Men and Spider-Man, and of course they killed Superman and brought him back.
Yeah.
That's what really sparked it. It was the writing, and that's what is if it's going to be anything, it's going to be the writing that's going to take us. Because an X Pro can get by on the fact that they have amazing art,
Yeah.
but even that, you can only do it so many times before the writing has to be there. So I think talking about writing is such, in the storytelling is so important. So give me a little idea of yourself. When did you start telling stories? Were you a liar as a kid, or just a storyteller as a kid, and it kind of grew? Or how did you get started realizing that you could tell a story, whether it was prose or whatever?
Um, so when I was a little kid, I used to basically, when you play games in the playground, right?
Mm-hmm.
Make believe games.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would basically create my own universes and teach all my friends about them, and then we would play in those universes. Which I know that is incredibly kind of goofy and juvenile, but that is
No,
that
it's
is the
yeah, it's the
Godfather's
beginning.
truth. That is the
Yeah.
truth. And all my friend, the fact that all my friends were playing along with it and they were really into it, and we started drawing what our characters look like, and it was kind of like this weird fusion of D&D and kind of kids playground antics. It was like LARPing basically, but it was always my games or whatever. And they were always influenced by what I was into at the time. So um,
Mm.
yeah, so it would always be Dragon Ball, or certain super, whatever, X-Men, whatever superhero thing was on TV at the time.
Right.
Pokemon, those types of things. Because I grew up in the 1990s, early thousands, so I'm of that generation where Japanese culture was really getting infused, with
Mm-hmm.
with the Western pop culture.
And there's a really big difference, though, just in not just the storytelling style of
Hmm.
the fact that, I mean, think about it. Most releases, I mean, granted, they do have the monthly manga magazines, but outside of those monthly magazines, most releases are 4 to 6 chapters at a time.
Yeah,
And so it's usually collected, it's usually volumes, and they will sell it anywhere. And then even that, you can pirate it, and most of the Japanese companies don't even try to stop the pirating, because
no,
some of them just see it as free advertising, that if somebody likes it enough, they'll eventually buy a physical copy or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's a very different view on how they do business. There
Well,
it's just keep telling the story and just keep getting it out.
Viz, which does, they've got Dragon Ball and they've got Naruto, which I think maybe some other exceptions, but they are probably the biggest anime manga franchises, especially to have permeated into the West.
Yeah.
They have their app, and you can get their entire back catalog of everything that they've ever done and new releases for $2 a month.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And
in translated into English.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's. I mean, heck, even Shonen Jump and all that are doing that now. Where for $5 a month you can
that's kind
get
of what I'm
access
talking about,
to everything. Yeah. And
so when I when I was playing these games or whatever with my classmates, eventually when my family got a computer and I figured out word processing, which was around the age of 8 or 9, I started writing my first book. It wasn't very good, but of course, but it was that was the first kind of seedlings of me becoming a writer. And I always wanted to be a writer. I was always writing things. I was always I got inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien. I got introduced to him, obviously through the movies that came out 2001, 2, and 3. Right. And the whole legendarium mythos universe of Tolkien really inspired me, and that got me really, into creating my own universes and worlds and games and so on. And and through that, I was writing prose fiction, and or dabbling in maybe like movie scripts or whatever.
Right.
Not knowing what would come out of it, because when you're 14, you think you think it's easy, don't you? You think, well, I'll write a book and then send it to a publisher and they'll read it. I don't know how many 14-year-old boys get published, but you don't know how difficult it is really until you actually get involved in it. And but I never really used to share it with anybody. And in my early 20s, I thought, I'm an adult now, so I can start looking at, I can actually do this, I can get it published, and so it can be a reality. I can make a career out of it. And I showed some of my work to some people that I was close to at the time. And long story short, they didn't just give me criticism, they ridiculed it. Right. And embarrassed me. And that made me put the pen down for a few years. And eventually, I can't remember how, but circumstances led to me and Kim Wasabi meeting. He's from Australia, I'm from England. At this point, I was still in England. We're on the opposite side of the world. And I got chatting to him. Him and I just kind of clicked immediately. And we started throwing ideas at each other and bouncing ideas off each other. And he and I started to share our writing with each other. This was in 2016, 2017. First thing I showed him was Aquila. This thing that I started to dip my feet into writing again. And I'd just been sat on my bed with a notepad, and I just started drawing something. And it was a Roman soldier. It was a sketch of a Roman soldier, and I started to tweak it so that he'd look more like a superhero. And I had this Roman soldier superhero, and I thought, what's a good name for a Roman soldier that's a superhero? And I went through them all. I went, legionary, praetorian, super Caesar, whatever, and Aquila, with the Roman eagle, that stood out, Aquila.
Yeah.
And somehow that transformed into a space policeman, a space cop. And the design, in the design of my character, there are still some you can still vaguely see the Roman elements, but it's transformed a lot from the original design. And then I started writing these scripts, and Kemosabe was like, he was blown away by them. He was telling me like, you're a natural. I don't really need to make any edits to this, but like, here's one of two things that you could do to make it a little bit better. But like, and I just kept on sending him stuff, and he just kept on saying the same thing. It was like, it would be a crime against humanity if your work was never read by anybody. You're really good. And for the time, I thought he was just blowing smoke, until I started showing other people, and other people started telling me, yeah, this is really good. You'd be dead good at this. This would be a great comic. But circumstances, life circumstances kind of got in the way. I was in jobs with non-compete clauses. I wasn't allowed to do other things to make money while I was working in these positions. And there was also other stuff that kind of were barricading me from dipping my toes into CG. So I was interested in getting involved in CG way back when Jawbreakers was first coming out and Cyberfrog was first coming out, and I was excited to get involved in that, but circumstances were as they were, and I just wasn't able to. I was still in the chats. I still watched EVS's videos, your boy Zach's videos, and some of the other big comic skaters. But I was using a different username back then, and old YouTube account that I have since deleted. So, but I'm here I am now. I've kind of got into the situation where I crossed an age threshold fairly recently, and I thought I'm not getting any younger, and I've got all this talent that people keep telling me I've got, and it's time. If there was ever a time, it's now to do it.
Right.
And this axiom has been kind of haunting me. Not haunting me in a positive way, I suppose, but it's indecision is the thief of opportunity.
Okay, so you talked about a little bit about, of course, manga, which again makes itself really available for kids and stuff, but also Tolkien being a thing. And actually, I would argue with people, and some people might not realize it, but the storytelling style is actually very similar between Tolkien and your average Eastern story, or maybe even the way manga kind of tells itself in chapters and in quests that are sectioned out. So do you have, in looking at the art is obviously manga inspired, but also it kind of has a little bit of Jim Henson to me, like some of the like it has kind of that like look to me, or something like puppets or something. Do you have a style that is distinctly yours, or is that what you're aiming for, or is it just a feel and an atmosphere?
So
what do you have?
When I first started writing Aquila, it was when streaming was really starting to take off, and I really liked Seinfeld, and I wanted to follow up on the closest thing to Seinfeld, which is Curb Your Enthusiasm, which I didn't realize was a completely different show.
Yeah, right.
And I started watching that, and I started to notice patterns in the way that he was writing, that Larry David would write these comedies, where there would be events that happen in the beginning that you would forget about throughout the middle of the story.
Right.
But then they would come back around at the end, and that would be the punchline.
Right.
And so
that's how I write.
So that is, I added that, and I thought that would be really good. I think that might work as a comic book formula, since it's only, I can have it be episodic. I can have it can be short. And so I started writing these like short, 16-page comic scripts. And eventually they would spread out the more I started to understand paneling and how I would start visualizing the comic in my head. And And so I realized that I had something. And when it came to designing the aliens, because I think that's what you're touching on, I really like the aliens from Dragon Ball. Not the ones, not like the main ones, not like Frieza and Cell's not an alien, but he kind of touches on it. Majin Buu, not with those. The ones that are in the background, the ones that haven't really got a lot of design to them. I really like that, and often some really cool designs and that you don't really notice. And I really like those types of aliens, and so. But I also, like you say, Henson. There is some crossover with Henson and Lucasfilm, and so obviously there's the Star Wars element with how many aliens within the sequels and to a lesser extent the prequels, and I also really like the Japanese tokusatsu genre. I really like a lot of the rubber suit monsters. And what I've always said is that I want my aliens to look like they could be made as rubber suit monsters. And I think that's where the Henson thing you were describing might have come from, because my aliens do look like rubber suit monsters. They do look like they could be puppets.
I'm a former puppeteer, so I did that for 6 years. So
cool.
Yeah. I tend to assign things stuff like that. So that's interesting. That would be so. That's an interesting idea for that.
I'm going from the George Lucas philosophy of when he made Star Wars. Star Wars was this combination of all the things he liked when he was a kid. He liked samurai movies. He liked science fiction serials, and he liked westerns. And he smashed them all together. And he liked, he also liked things like car movies and stuff, which is where Han Solo comes from. And he smashed all these elements together and came out with something completely unique. And I'm kind of going for the same thing with Aquila, where I'm taking all the stuff that I liked as a kid. So, Star Wars, manga, and just science fiction, superhero, because I did. Even though I didn't really have many comics, I did have, superheroes were very much in my frame of mind when I was a kid. I had the Spider-Man animated series, the X-Men 90s animated series, then X-Men Evolution, and a lot of the other smaller shows from that era. And also, when I was a kid, I absolutely loved Power Rangers. And so that's where I think the biggest thing in Aquila's design comes from. He looks like he's straight out of a Power Rangers lineup, and so that there's a lot of that in there. There's a lot of that influence in the design.
Right. So that sort of action adventure, sci-fi genre and style to it. Is that the style that you sort of think that you excel in, or do you write multiple genres, multiple styles?
I think I've got a lot of range as a writer. I do prefer to write adventures though. Mysteries, not really my thing. Detective stories, those types of things. I'm more interested in the beat cop kind of side of it rather than a detective story. And so that's where that's the kind of difference between me and Kemosabe. Kemosabe absolutely loves his pulp stories and his detectives. I like the stories about the guys that kick down your door. I'm a lot more interested in that type of thing. So car chases and like Die Hard kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's awesome. That's it's always interesting to see the different types, because I've watched a lot of interviews with some of the old movie makers, and I actually have directed a few films back in the day and done the whole media thing that's in a former life. But one of the things I would do is watch different directors discuss what they did, especially ones in the 40s and 50s, because I feel like they were on this era where they still had it was still very like primitive, but at the same time they were on the edge of technology to where they could do things that were revolutionary.
Yeah.
And like Hitchcock, he did that, where people like to talk about him being like, a horror or a suspense or whatever, and all the different things. And he would always say that his thing was is that he's not a horror guy, he's a suspense guy. And he said the difference is horror is when you don't know what the thing is or what's happening, and you're going to try and find out, but it's getting, as it reveals itself, it becomes something terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
He said he is about suspense because he wants to tell you exactly what it is from the beginning. Like, he's going to tell you there is a bomb, it is under your chair, it is going to blow up in 15 minutes. And then he wants to see how people react to that information and figure out why, how to avoid it. So the suspense idea was what he cared about. He didn't care anything about horror. His thing was all about building suspense and having suspense. So it definitely takes all kinds to tell stories, because some people like that, they're just not into a whodunit. They're more into a how they did it. It's
Yeah.
so there's definitely many ways to tell a story and to tell a good story as well. So
Yeah.
I
Completely
really
agree.
appreciate that. So when it comes down to telling a story for you, and you sit down, and like for with Aquila, you've spent so many years on it now that this is probably going to be a hard question because of all the building it goes into it. But let's just say you were to say, okay, you've published a couple of Aquila and you're going to try something new.
Yeah.
What's the first thing you do when you sit down? Like, you got this new idea that's been kicking around in your head for a year. You're going to sit down and you're going to write it out. You're going to come up with it, whatever you're going to do. What's the first thing you do when you sit down? The very first thing.
Depends on what I'm writing. If I'm writing a comic book, the first thing I'll do is I'll start like just kind of typing and seeing where it goes. Okay. I tend to type up like a summary of a story, and then I go back to the beginning, the first paragraph, and then I embellish it a bit more, and then I embellish it until I've got until I've filled it out and filled out the gaps. Then I go to the next step, which is actually converting that treatment, I guess you'd call it, into into whatever medium it's supposed to be. So I can either do it as a comic script on the comic writing software that I use, or I can do it as a word processor if it's prose.
Okay.
Then I'll start writing a few chapters, and sometimes it will go somewhere, sometimes it won't. Most of the times it doesn't. But I always keep whatever I write, because I can always go back and harvest ideas from them,
Okay.
But I'm always writing stories. I'm always writing universes and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
For Aquila, I've got a bunch of scripts already written. So I've kind of got this vault where I can just, next time for the next book, and the script's already written. Just needs to go through a bit of refinement and a bit of editing, and and then because I've been working on this guy since 2017, so that's 5.5 years or something. So it's a long time, and I've got a lot of books already written for him, and I've got characters as well that are going to be in the same universe, but they're going to be exploring different aspects of that universe. So there would be somebody that, because Aquila, it's small scale. It's cops and robbers in the solar system. It's bandits and sheriffs in the solar system. But I've got more kind of like cosmic adventures, and I've got some other different that explore different sci-fi subgenres, I guess you'd say. within the and also like sword and sword. What's it? Not sword and sword sorcery. What's it called? What I don't know how you define the
Sword and Sandal. That's
whatever
the Journeyer one.
I'm thinking of like Warlord of Mars and the and that whatever you'd call that.
Yeah, that's sword. Well, that's I guess that's sci-fi pulp.
Yeah,
But
stuff
sword and
that kind
sorcery
of,
stuff and all that. Yeah.
yeah, but that basically, but that's on distant planets.
Yeah.
And stuff
Yeah.
like that. Yeah. So I've got a bunch of stuff ready that is
Okay.
just basically waiting for we'll see how Aquila #1 does, and hopefully once if it's successful I can have Aquila 2. I
Right.
don't even have to write the script; it's already done.
So again, going and kind of getting our heads around the idea of, because again, like I said, I figured as much with 5 years worth of work.
Yeah.
You have a lot already in there. So like with this theoretical idea that you sat down and you just kind of wrote out, you kind of figured out a story for it, and now you're going to say, you know what, I am going to try and make that into a comic book. And so you're going to try and move it into that medium. Do you use story beats? Do you use bullet pointing? Do you just try and say, okay, I just want it to flow a certain way or feel right? How do you sort of break that down and turn that into a plot or turn that into a script?
So I kind of have an imaginary picture in my head of beginning, middle, and end. How many pages I need to be in the beginning, how many pages I need in the middle, and how many pages I need in the end. And I write short comics. I don't write great big long 65-page graphic novels or anything like that. I write short, very short traditional comics. So my average story is between 16 and 20 something pages. This Aquila book that's coming out is 24 pages. That's on the longer side of the stuff that I've written. So I do a bit of mathematics and I figured out how many pages I need to spend on each. And then I just start writing. And if I kind of spend too long on one thing or I spend too long on another, the beauty about comic books is that it's panels, so I could always go back and see if I could combine two panels, or I could, or if I could add a panel somewhere where there's not many panels. Am I wasting a page on a splash that doesn't need to be a splash? And I go through that type of motion, and then when I get to the end, which is always going to be somewhere between 16 and 25 pages, I kind of try and condense it as much as possible, in hopes of, basically in hopes of, basically using the medium as much as I can. What am I spending? Like, what am I having the characters say that doesn't need to be said? If somebody is, I don't know, if somebody's shooting a ray gun, I don't need the character to say he's got a ray gun, or I don't need, I don't need, if there's only two people in a conversation and you've included somebody's name and he keeps saying the name over and over again, so I go through and I try and condense it, because I don't want giant word balloons taking up my art, and I don't want, the average reader, I think they spend, I don't even know, it's like 8 seconds per panel or something. It's even less than that. And so I want the ones that do go back and kind of look at the panels, I want them to sort of appreciate the art as much as they can, instead of having it all covered up by paragraphs and paragraphs of word balloons.
Right. So going with that, with the idea of dialogue, do you write your dialogue right away and then refine it later, or is dialogue secondary? That's used.
I write it as I write the script.
Okay.
Yeah. So I go. The software I use really does follow. It really works with my writing process really well. So I write out what happens in the panel, and then you hit the enter key of a return key, and it then moves to a speech section.
Okay, can I real quickly just ask what you're using? Because I have several. I have Scrivener and
I use Celtex.
Celtex. Yeah, I have Celtex as well.
But
Yeah.
I use the antique version of Celtex, where
Yeah.
you just where so I
Right.
use like a really old version of Celtex that really fits my needs.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I've used Celtex in the past. Uh, but yeah, so I like to just throw names like that out so if somebody is listening, they can get an idea of what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, but so yeah, that's cool because yeah, I kind of start with the dialogue, and then I use that at the end to sort of be what I use to like if I'm looking at something and I say, you know what, something is not right, then I'll refine the dialogue to sort of fit
Yeah.
what ended up in the end being the thing. But I do that because it's funny. I was watching a documentary about Stan Lee and Ditko doing
Uh,
Spider-Man, and they
yeah.
said one of the things that's funny. Of course, Ditko would have the idea,
Mhm.
the general. He knew what he was supposed to try and say at the end, and he would just do his thing. And then Stan Lee would go down and write the dialogue to what was there. Ditko would just say, "This is the point," or "This is what was basically happened." Give him
Yeah.
the stuff, he'd write the dialogue. And Stan Lee, for whatever reason, for three scripts in a row, for three comics in a row, had like mentioned something about Mary Jane in the very beginning of the book, and that they were going to like show up, and they didn't show up at all because for whatever reason Ditko just didn't have the space, he didn't have the pages, whatever, and they didn't show up in the
Right.
comic. But the first two times it was just sort of like left that way. It was like the second or third time somebody was like, "Hey, they sent it out to get for them to do the lettering," and they sent back a note and said, you've mentioned Mary Jane, but she doesn't show that she's coming around, but she does not show up again in the entire book. Do you want to do something about this?" And instead of taking it out because they had already gotten past that part, they already lettered that part, Stan Lee goes, "Hold on a second." And he looks through and he was like page 16 or something. And he goes, page 16, panel 3, I want such and such to say, "Hey, what happened to Mary Jane?" And Spidey to say, "No worries. She's she decided to have lunch with Aunt May instead."
Yeah.
And they were like, "That fixes it." They're like, "All right, perfect." And they just went on about their life, just totally fixing
Yeah.
a storyline that kept getting mentioned but not addressed, and just
Mm.
completely got rid of it with a piece of dialogue. And I'm like, that's pretty inventive to totally just get rid of something
Yeah.
with a line like that. So
Well,
that's why I do that. I use the dialogue at the end to sort of fix anything that I feel like needs to be fixed.
yeah. Well, something like that, similar to that, happened when I was writing this Aquila.
Mm-hmm.
When once it got so there's two versions of the book. The first version I had done by a different artist who is completely unaffiliated with CG. It's somebody I got on Fiverr, and they were a manga style artist,
Right.
and they generally did slice of life stories, romance stories, that type of thing, and they tried very hard to do a science fiction action comic, but I just wasn't 100% pleased with what I
Right.
got. I thought this can't be my my entry into Aquila, and so I kind of I didn't want this book to go out the way it was, and I really appreciate all the hard work that they did, but that just couldn't be my book. It couldn't be my first book, and so I spoke with a few people, and they said, "Yeah, it seems like maybe you should go back to the beginning and start all over because you've got a really good idea, you've got a really good story, you've got really good cover already done, you've got two good covers really already done." Um, you know, and Odin said, "Well, my artist Kari, she's very very fast, and she can do pages very very quickly, and if you hire her, we'll have the book ready sometime in the middle of summer, and we'll this was in like March or April or something like that. This was a few months ago. It wasn't really that long ago.
Right.
But like I said, I kind of looked at the big picture and I thought, well, I think that I could write a better ending. I think the ending could be more spectacular. Like, this is going to be my first foray into comics. Maybe I could do something a lot more epic with the end, with the climax. And so I went back and I kind of went through the original story that I'd written, and I was like, where could I what could I do differently? Because I don't want to change the story too much. I need to have all the same characters on the front page. I need to have the general gist of the story to follow in the same way, but I need something else. And I went in there and I just kind of, the last third of the book, I just completely rewrote a different action scene. I went back through the story and I made tweaks to the dialogue earlier, some of the scenes earlier on, and led to a different situation that would eventually occur later on in the book. So there is a moment in this book where the original and the canon version, the prototype and the canon versions, they're pretty much similar until one specific point where it diverges. And I'm still gonna sell the prototype version on the campaign. It's going to be an add-on to the campaign, so you'll still be able to get that. I think we're going to go 100% digital for the add-on. You'll be able to see, basically, there's going to be a point at which the stories diverge and there's going to be alternate endings. So so that's kind of what I was trying to say was like, once we got the original one lettered, I went through and I thought, this doesn't really look good. This could cause a giant explosion, or this could really seriously harm somebody. And I've got a character who's meant to be a hero. He's putting people's lives in danger. How can I change this? The art is already done. How can I change this to make it so that he's doing something heroic instead of something reckless? And so I changed some of the dialogue, and I added, I spoke to Dean James, my letterer, and he made a few changes here and there. And the other thing is that because my original artist did it in manga style, they incorporated the speech bubbles onto the art, which is they didn't do. So they didn't give me the scenery without the speech bubbles. The speech bubbles were already put there themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So in some circumstances, they have these giant word balloons.
Yeah.
And there's only one word or something that was meant to go in it. And so I would have to say, well, I can't just have all this white space. So I would have to embellish the dialogue a little bit, and make it a bit more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Fuller.
Fuller, I was looking for a more flowery word, but
to fill up the word balloon. Yeah, I've been there actually, because when I used to do comics when I was a kid, mm-hmm. I drew the bubbles in so that I knew how to draw the characters around the speech bubbles.
Right.
And I took that in. I brought that with me in my 20s when I started drawing again. I kind of left it for a while, started painting. And then when I got back into drawing, I started doing it again. And real quickly, I had that same problem where I had a speech bubble that was tiny, because originally I thought there was going to be 2 words. Yeah. And then I decided that they needed a sentence. And I'm like, oh, no. I've got a big old face there in this little tiny word balloon. I need to stop doing that crap. Yeah. So, I've been there. So I understand that. So with Aquila, I'm going to give us your elevator pitch, just quick, 15, 30 seconds, whatever you would say, is to just get someone to say, this is what Aquila is. And this is why you should get it.
So Aquila with the Phoenix Guard is my first foray into writing putting out a comic book. I have been called by Kemosabe the greatest Silver Age writer that didn't live in the Silver Age. So there's a lot of high praise there from somebody who himself is such a outstanding writer in his own right. Aquila is a space cop for an organization called the Phoenix Guard. He is the only police law enforcement agent in our solar system. Because the galactic government doesn't care about our solar system, it has become a den of thieves, a den of crime, because all the criminals like to hide away. It's a bit of a pirate's cove. So Aquila's got his work cut out for him as he is protecting our solar system, our planet, from crooks and ruffians and bandits and villainy of all shapes and sizes from all around the universe. It's going to be a 25-page black and white comic traditional style, beginning, middle, and an end, but there are elements that will lead to future stories.
Right.
What separates me from other writers is that I think a lot of stories, a lot of these comic books that are being put out, a lot of them are very graphic novel length, a lot of them are very great big epic stories. I've kind of gone back to the roots of comic books from very early age, and we've got a very basic but exciting and interesting premise and fun story that you can share with all your family. That's a bit longer than 15 seconds, but
no, that's fine.
That's my full elevator pitch.
The first part
we're going to the 60th too. Floor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was an elevator pitch for a
skyscraper.
Yeah, yeah. That's but so that's great.
Yeah.
I had a question on the tip of my brain, but it's like it's one of the things I'm trying to remember it now. But so I always have the final questions. We're going to go into the final questions, and the first thing I want to ask is, if you had to say, like, what was the most important moment in your development as a storyteller, what would you say that was? Or at least maybe the thing that, say, kind of put you over to where you said, okay, now I think I actually am a storyteller.
Positive criticism.
Okay.
Positive feedback. Like I said, my early 20s, I showed my work to somebody, and not just one person, but several people, and they belittled me so much that I just didn't want to pick up a pen again. And all it took was for somebody to positively tell me that I've done something really, really good, and that I'm capable of doing more. And that sort of set me back on my path, where I really started to believe in myself, and I really started to think that I'm a really great writer, and that I can compete with some of the great writers that we've got coming into comics today.
Right. So
it's a very simple thing, but it's the truth. It's the truth. If Kemosabe hadn't put me over as much as he had, I don't think I would be here today publishing a comic this week.
Right.
Not publishing it, but releasing the crowdfunding, starting the crowdfunding campaign.
Right. No, absolutely. Believe me, I agree with you. It's not an unimportant thing, and it's not little, because I've struggled with that kind of issue myself. Had a couple people that love nothing more than to sort of knock you down a peg, and it's like, it's hard to get around that sometimes. So let's just say for young writers, or just people starting out with writing, I tend to find a lot of people who start writing later in life, they tend to be like D&D players or something, or like and they kind of think to themselves, you know what, D&D is basically telling a story, in a journeying story too. Maybe I can actually write something. What would you make a case for them? Because I've actually had some people tell me, like, I wish I could tell a story, but I can't. And I'm like, you've written hundreds of these D&D pages. Mm-hmm. I'm like, if you came to that person and you say, you should write, just see what happens, what would be the case for writing it, or what would be the first thing you would tell them to do when it comes to writing?
I've never played a game of Dungeons and Dragons in my entire life, so
it's very similar to what you were doing with your friends.
I understand the principle.
Yeah.
I understand kind of the general thing. Writing advice. I think start small. I think a lot of people they have go into these stories with grand ambitions where they want to write great big 7-book chronicles, and until you've until you've written a little thing, you don't know if you can go into writing these great big epics. And I'd say start small and achievable goals. If you put out a book that's got a beginning, middle, and end, people like it, then they'll be willing to invest in longer stories in you in the future. And the way things are going, it's going to be gig economy, crowdfunding, it's going to be self-publishing, and you're gonna want to, I don't want to say be cheap, but you want to be realistic. Most people don't have mountains and mountains of cash, especially if you're in your 20s and early 30s. Most people don't have a lot of money, but so you want to scale things back, put out a small book, see how it does. If it's successful, if it's successful, that's great. You don't have these high expectations, and you won't be disappointed that you haven't been able to fund your 100-page epic graphic novel, and those types of things, they play into your psyche. If you can get people to read a 25-page book, then they'll read a 30-page book, and then you can build on that. Right. Don't go into these things with these unrealistic expectations, and start small and achievable goals.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, that's yeah, it's all about getting a momentum going. Start with something that you can achieve, and then figure out how to achieve it. Yeah, that's absolutely, that works. So with that, we're getting into the wrapping up portion. Where can people find you about? Where do you hang out mainly, and how can people contact you and everything beyond signing up for the pre-launch?
Yeah, well, you can at me on Twitter. It's at comicsardvark. That's aardvark spelled AARDVARK. It's a bit of a difficult word. Some people forget the 2 A's. At comicsardvark on Twitter. That's where you can hit me up. I also have a YouTube channel that I very infrequently use, but I'll always be in the chats on pretty much anything that's live at the moment. I go on. I'll be in B Rose. I'll be in Bancroft. If you see me there, give me an at, give me a hail.
Yeah, all right, absolutely. And that's so for anybody out there who is looking to write a story or get into storytelling, maybe you don't want to necessarily be a writer, but you're an artist and you're like, nobody wants to give you a job. So the best way to get started might be to write your own short story, write your own four-page story, and just come up with what it's going to be, write it, illustrate it, send it out to people, post it on Instagram, post it on, all around the web, on Twitter, tag people in it, ask people to look at it, just contact somebody, say, hey, would you look at this? I think anything at all that you can do to get yourself out there is always a good thing. And I think in this space right now, sure, there's a lot of negativity, and Twitter can be a horrible place to be sometimes, but there's a lot of positivity too. So don't be afraid to get out there and make friends with people and contact, follow Aardvark, follow, myself if you want to, follow Kemosabe. Kemosabe's great for getting information about how to write and just how to stay creative as you move forward. So with that, we have been speaking with comic book writer Aardvark, the writer of Aquila of the Phoenix Guard. number 1, Nightmare Fuel, that will be launching on the 15th of this month. So if you're watching this in the future, it might be live and you might be able to go pick it up. And I just want to make sure I thank you for watching it. And if you liked it, don't forget to do the YouTube stuff. Comment, subscribe, share it on Twitter, because obviously it's a small channel. It's the only way we get out there. But like always, I tell everybody, if you hated it, please put a downvote and tell me why you hated it, what could be changed, why it sucked, what you didn't like about it. And if it's mean, if it's really mean, I'll pin it and make it the top comment on the video. So with that, I am the Christian Nomad, and I thank you for watching, and God bless.